Many games in the Final Fantasy franchise are known for their intricate scenarios and deep world building, and the way that the different elements interacted often allowed for some world-class build-up that culminated in a single, impactful ending. An ending that made the most sense in the context of that particular universe. However, not every Final Fantasy game has taken this linear approach. Some games offered players the option to experience multiple endings, and this naturally had its strengths and weaknesses. On the one hand, it could make the ending intended to be the most canon feel less definitive, but it can also help to frame the value of the true canon ending by providing players with an alternative, bad ending to compare it to. This can be pretty effective because most often than not, these bad endings are juxtaposed to the true ending. That's why we wanted to go over 7 bad Final Fantasy endings that were actually quite harsh. And to kick things off, we're going to focus on an ending that was so harsh that it led to the destruction of the entire world. The bad ending of Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII. Oh, and if it wasn't already very clear, there will be mass spoilers in this video. Final Fantasy XIII started with a group of mostly strangers. They were forced into working together in an attempt to escape the fate imposed on them by a fal'Cie. As the story progressed, each of them had to come to terms with how their own lives were changing, but also what they assumed was an inevitable death. Since they were marked as l'Cie, their only path forward was either to fulfill their focus and turn to crystal, or fail and turn into a Seath. Either fate was an ending of sorts, and although the party did their best to rebel against larger forces in the world to forge their own path, their stories still largely remained personal. The sequel games, however, went a totally different route, focusing on grander and more existential stakes. And this was reflected in what was quite possibly the harshest of the alternate endings of the sequel games. Lightning Returns was structured so that players had a finite number of days to complete all of the game's main quests. However, if they did not complete these quests by the final day, the world of Nova Chrysalia was destroyed, and the player encountered a game over screen with a chilling message, "And so the world ends." Part of the reason this ending was so harsh is that it came at the tail end of a long journey, a journey which ultimately ended in failure. After fighting so hard and surviving the events of the original game, the sequel game, and making it to the very end of the third game, the world ended. Lightning died. It created a retroactive feeling of futility, imparting the notion that all of the past sacrifice and fighting may have been for nothing in the end. As hard as Lightning fought, she was resigned to failure, never being truly able to escape her fate. But as harsh as the destruction of Nova Chrysalia was, the bad ending in Final Fantasy X-2 felt a little bit worse. X-2 served as a departure from Final Fantasy X in terms of gameplay, tone, and narrative style, but it was still a very comprehensive and detailed game. It explored what happened to the world of Spira, and the people in it after the cycle of death and destruction caused by sin for centuries no longer existed. This was portrayed in small ways through settlements like Kilika shown to be rebuilding, and larger ways through the disposition and lifestyles of the former heroes that saved the world, like Waka, Lulu, and Yuna. Everything was generally a lot more cheerful than the bleak original game, but there were still very dark elements depicted through the Den of Woe and the Crimson Squad. Elements like this saw the stakes of Final Fantasy X-2 being much greater than that of Final Fantasy X. Although Sin was a society-destroying monster that acted on instinct and caused mass death, it wasn't an immediate threat to the entirety of Spira. But the main threat of X-2, Vegnagun, was. An ancient machina that was created by Bevelle during the Ancient Machina War, its power was so great that it was designed to destroy Spira so that nobody won. For any player who secretly craved this scenario, well, that could be seen through the bad ending. During the final battle against Vegnagun, there was a secret timer, which resulted in Vegnagun firing its primary weapon when the timer elapsed. Although the game didn't explicitly show the countdown timer on screen, dialogue did imply that Vegnagun needed to be defeated before the weapon fully charged. If Vegnagun then fired its primary weapon, it proceeded to destroy Spira, the worst possible outcome. It's important to note, however, that this ending did not trigger if players simply lost to Vegnagun through other means, such as the party member's HP reaching 0 from Vegnagun's normal attacks. Now, although bad endings like this are often optional, World of Final Fantasy took a very different route by making its bad ending mandatory. World of Final Fantasy was a unique entry in the franchise because it created a new world but also had incredible references to the rest of the franchise. Within this world, twins Rain and Lam were designed as Mirage Keepers, which gave them the power to control manifestations of classic Final Fantasy monsters called Mirages. Both heroes set out on a journey to recover their memories and combat evil, alongside champions from various Final Fantasy games. As the story progressed, the pair eventually ended up challenging the leaders of the evil army, in the hopes of stopping Brandelis. However, as the pair fought Brandelis, they experienced a string of emotionally devastating events. They learned that they were the reasons that Brandelis even existed in the world, as they summoned him prior to losing their memories. This made them responsible for the mass death and destruction that Brandelis and his army had caused. Adding to this, the pair also discovered that their long-lost mother had been possessed by the XIII Knight Pellinor, whom they had been fighting, and upon making this discovery, Brandelis immediately killed their mother. The pain the twins felt caused them to madly attack Brandelis, but their attacks had no effect. Lan realised that the only way to stop Brandelis was to sacrifice himself, so he imprisoned them together inside a magical crystal cage for all of eternity. Rain, who had to move forward in the world without Lan, tragically lost her will to live and resigned herself to an empty life where she tried to suppress the pain by becoming a shut-in who was a shadow of the hero she once was. Fittingly, the song Silent World played during the credits. This was the game's main ending, and it was devastating. However, players had the option of playing through World of Final Fantasy's post-game, giving them the chance to redo events and find a way to defeat Brandelis without everything going so wrong. Final Fantasy IV The After Years was a much belated sequel to Final Fantasy IV. It released in Japan 17 years after the original game, first as an episodic mobile title before it was then ported to WiiWare, which was how international audiences were first introduced to it. Due to the nature of the game, it took some time during its original Japanese run before players were able to witness the conclusion of the game. But what they experienced wasn't always the same, as the developers put in scenario elements to make sure it wasn't a linear experience. And this meant provisions were put in place for an ending that wasn't so happy and jovial. The bad ending of the After Years occurred based on a sliding scale. Depending on what happened earlier in the game, such as characters dying during missions, this meant some members of the Eblan 4 may not show up during the ending cutscenes. And based on how many members of the Eblan 4 did die during the playthrough, this could make the ending feel very lonely. This effect was then amplified by knowing what the ending looked like when all of the members survived and had their part to play in the finale. What's interesting, however, is that this wasn't something that players of the 3D remake version ever had to worry about. Whenever a character died during the 3D remake, players were given a continue screen, which meant a character could never truly die in that story. In the original version, this meant the permanent death of a party member carried a lot more emotional weight for a player who had spent the entire game journeying with them. That then brings us nicely onto our next entry. Final Fantasy XV was notorious for being launched as a somewhat complete project at the end of a troubled development cycle. There were clear gaps in the story and oddities with how it was delivered. But to their credit, the development team set to right the wrongs by providing a huge amount of post-game support via free and paid-for updates. As part of this, Noctis' retinue each gained individual episodes that focused on their own personal narratives, and the quality kept getting better with every subsequent release. It meant that when episode Ignis launched, expectations were pretty high, and it did not disappoint. Part of this was due to how much care and attention was placed on developing the narrative arc of Ignis, but it was also thanks to there being multiple conclusions. There was, of course, a canon ending, but one of the alternate endings was bittersweet, as it felt like an amplification of the canon ending. In the bad ending, Ignis initially accepted Arden's invitation to join him. But when Ignis learnt Arden's real identity and of his wider plans, he attempted to attack Arden using the power of the Ring of the Lucii in an attempt to save his friends. This decision came at a huge cost, however, as in order to be granted the power of the Ring of the Lucii, Ignis knew that he would have to sacrifice his own life. If Ignis then lost the fight against Arden, players were subjected to a sad scene where Ignis lay on the ground before Arden as he was mocked for his failure. Ignis, in his final moments, then comments that he is dying alone, and this was very hard to watch given that the core theme of the story was around brotherhood. The notion of losing everything can be quite powerful, and that's something that Final Fantasy Type 0 also played on in its bad ending. Type 0 was originally released on the PlayStation Portable in Japan, but it then saw an international release a few years later as Type 0 HD. The story centered around Class 0, a class of cadets from a magic academy who fight against the Militesi Empire and then try to free themselves from an endless cycle. The game's standard ending was very emotional. The members of Class 0 all died, but did so in a heroic way, sacrificing themselves to defeat the Rurson Arbiter while giving their allies and the rest of the world a chance to continue fighting for a better future. Despite this tear-jerking conclusion though, the bad ending was much worse. As players approached the end of the game, they were made an offer to become a lessee by the Vermilion Berg Crystal, one of the 4 crystals in the world of Orience. If they accepted this offer, they were sent to fight an insurmountable number of Rurson Reavers, which eventually led to the death of all members of Class 0. As a result of this choice though, the world of Orience was also destroyed, meaning Class 0's attempt to gain power by becoming a lessee ultimately backfired and led to the end of everything they held dear. But that then brings us on to Final Fantasy V. Unlike many other mainline entries in the franchise, Final Fantasy V did not see international release until quite a few years later. This meant it wasn't released in North America until 1999, and Europeans had to wait until 2002. This meant Final Fantasy V existed in a state that many fans of the franchise couldn't reach for years, despite knowing it was out there and having its potential release teased many times. Which is actually sort of fitting, because it mirrors the bad ending of the game. During the game's final moments, any party members that were KO'd became unable to leave the void once the battle concluded. This resigned those characters to a life of isolation in the void, forever out of reach from their loved ones. Although it was similar to a traditional hero's sacrifice, in that party members sacrificed themselves so they could save the world, it hit a bit differently here. Because characters who were in the void were alive after they made their sacrifice, they were forced to spend their time dealing with the consequences of their actions. Any regret or mental distress that came with recognizing what they had left behind and what their future held could actually still affect them. Although a different number of characters could be resigned to the void depending on which characters actually got KO'd during the final battle, the saddest outcome occurred when only one party member was left behind in the void, and players knew that they had to deal with the consequences of their sacrifice completely alone, making for a very harsh reward for their commitment to seeing victory through. But with that, they were 7 bad endings from Final Fantasy games that actually ended up being rather harsh on the emotions. But how many of these endings have you seen? Be sure to let us know in the comments below, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent and Sukun DDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.